for joining us. My name is Catherine Robertson, and I'm the Technical Services Librarian at the Phillips Library, and I will be serving as your moderator for this afternoon. I would like to begin by respectfully acknowledging that the Peabody Essex Museum is on the ancestral territory of the Agawam, Pawtucket, Namkeg, Massachusetts, and Wampanoag. Many other Indigenous communities have lived and moved through this place over hundreds of generations, and Indigenous people from many nations live and work in this region today. Please join me in honoring their communities, their elders past and present, as well as future generations. Some housekeeping items. Everyone is currently muted and off camera, but we encourage you to introduce yourself in the chat and put any questions you have for our panelists in the Q&A box, and we'll get to as many as possible at the end of the program. Closed captioning is also available, and this session is being recorded and will be available on the PEM YouTube page. The Phillips Library Reading Room in Rowley, Massachusetts is open and available to the public by appointment Wednesday through Friday. Please email research@pem.org if you are interested in making an appointment. I'll start by quickly introducing our panelists. David Solo is a Brooklyn-based collector, independent writer and researcher, and patron focused on artist books and photo books. He is a frequent speaker on artist photo books in New York and Europe, and is actively involved with a number of institutions in London and New York. Most recently, he is working on the global history of photography and poetry in book form, as well as related photo text topics. Stephanie Tung is Associate Curator for Exhibitions and Research at PEM. She earned her BA in Comparative Literature and History of Art at Harvard University and an MA in Art and Archaeology from Princeton University. Prior to joining PEM in 2018, she worked at the Three Shadows Photography Art Center in Beijing, China, as a curator and director of international affairs. Sal Taylor-Kydd is a UK photographer and artist whose work has been exhibited internationally, including New York, Boston, Los Angeles, Mexico, and Spain. She's also a writer and poet and has self-published a number of books combining poetry with photographs. Her latest book, Landfall, is about the islands off the coast of Maine. We're going to start today's program with a short overview of the genre of photo poetry. We'll then move to a live show and tell featuring some examples of books in the Phillips Library collection spanning the 19th to through 21st centuries. Finally, we'll hear from Sal Taylor-Kydd on her current work and see a live flip through and reading from her most recent publication, Landfall. Liz and Steph, please take it away.
Well, thank you, Katie. And thank you to the Phillips Library for organizing this wonderful event. This is wonderful. I can't see anybody, but that's okay. I'm going to assume that you're all there. It's great to be here, and it's great to be talking with Dave. Is Dave there too?
I am.
Okay, great. Okay, hello. It's great to see you. So photo poetry, this is a new genre to me, but not to you. And so I wanted to ask, first of all, what is photo poetry and how did you get started collecting it?
Well, thank you, Stephanie, and Catherine and the Peabody Essex Museum for this opportunity to talk about my favorite topic. Simply put, photo poetry is combining a photograph and a poem, potentially side by side, but in some forms as alternating sections of a book, or even as merged objects drifting into the visual poetry space. For today's program, the works have both media present, although one can think about a spectrum that ranges from poetic or lyrical photos without any words to ekphrastic poems without images. And just as there are a range of forms, there are also many modes of collaboration, which can range from a single artist as both photographer and poet, to a partnership between artists, which is quite common, to commissioned illustrations or an artistic response to existing work, or an editor or artist choosing pairings. There's also quite a long history of combining poetry and images, going back nearly to the dawn of photography. Constance Fox Talbot took photos of a Moore poem in 1843, and Louis Auguste Martin produced a pamphlet with photography and poetry as a promotion for railway excursions from Paris in 1850, which are probably two of the earliest examples. Photo poetry started appearing in book form in the 1850s, largely as an alternative to engraved or other graphic illustrations, including sometimes photographs of drawings themselves. This was perhaps to take advantage of the novelty factor of this new medium of photography, and also in hopes of a less expensive option compared to commissioning an engraver. More on that later. If we go to the next slide, many examples, as shown here, early on were for illustrated editions of some of the Romantic poets, in this case, Lady of the Lake by Sir Walter Scott. For my journey, I've been collecting, exploring, and talking about artists and photo books for at least 25 years, and often drawn to combinations of image and text. I think about 6 or 7 years ago, I had acquired a few photo poetry examples, and as collectors are wont to do, decided to look for more and discovered that this really was not a thing and that you couldn't search for it. Libraries, booksellers, etc., didn't catalog things in any way that allowed you to say, I'm looking for photo poetry. A common response when I would ask was, nobody's ever asked about that. Let me get back to you. And fortunately, many did. And that started a long journey of exploring this space, asking all manner of folks that I met if they knew of examples. Some of them are tired of me asking, and encountering a few other explorers along the way. But it's been a lot of fun, and there seems to be quite a bit more of it than I had initially realized, with quite a few great discoveries, including learning about poets and photographers I didn't know, with quite a lot being made today. It can still sometimes be a challenge when I pick up a book to figure out if it qualifies, particularly asking the question of, is this text a poem or is it something else? Although if the writer is living, they're usually more than happy to ask. But Stephanie, you're, as you said, kind of a bit of a newcomer to this space. And I'd love to hear what you see when you encounter some work and such work, and how you respond, how you read it, etc.
Thanks, Dave. I mean, I think this is it's been really interesting learning from you, because I've been seeing so many different examples. And I do think it's really interesting because it challenges the viewer in different ways. And I think I'm approaching this photo poetry genre in at least 2 different levels. And so I can speak a little bit about that here. I think on a very, very basic level, I think I'm thinking about the connections between the photo and the poetry. As you said, with like this Lady of the Lake example, it's a little bit more straightforward. On the left-hand side, you see the photograph of Stirling Castle. On the right-hand side, you see the narrative poem by Walter Scott, and it's talking about this epic battle that takes place in Scotland. And so I'm reading about the castle gates were open flung, the quivering drawbridge rocked and rung. And then I'm looking back at the photograph, and it's providing like a setting for, I think, all this action to take place. And so there's this given back and forth. It's not illustrative per se, but there is something about this photograph that is providing a setting for us to roam in, for us to imagine. And so I think that's a little bit of the things that we've looked at together. I think that's a much more straightforward. In the next slide, Facile, I think this one is a classic. And I think this one is a classic because it does something very, very interesting with the design. My eye is going up the silhouette of the woman's body, and then it's going across the body to the gloves on the right-hand page. And then I'm looking at the poem. And the poem, I think, is Paul Eluard's love poem to his wife, Noosh. And it's talking about how it's about touch, it's about the woman's body, it's about hands and how the man's hands fits hers like a glove. And so you're seeing these resonances between, I think, the poem and then like the photography, where it's going back and forth in this like circle as I like go around the actual page. And I think that's one of the real pleasures of this example. You're actually thinking about the design and then the format integrated into one. And it's very, very interesting that like every time I do a pass with a circle, new sort of meanings and connections pop out. There's definitely some sort of reverberation. So in that sense, there's that connection between the photo and the poem that I think is really interesting. But I'm thinking on another level in terms of how then the photo and the poetry are different. By putting them together, they are actually throwing the things into their differences into relief as well. The photo, you have to, you are struck by that first impression. And then the poem, of course, you have to read. And so there's an element of time that comes into play that I think is really interesting. You're always negotiating between the first impression of the photography and then the flow of the poetry, which is about, I guess, rhythm. It's about sequence and building of images and mood and narrative. And so that element of time is actually, I think, putting the two media in contrast to each other and then pushing them into relief as well. And so that's something that I was quite unexpected for me as like a newcomer. And it's actually quite challenging. It's actually asking more of a reader than I think just a poem or a photo by themselves would. And I don't know, this is something that I think possibly the meanings that I derive from it as a reader would be much different from somebody else, because it's something about the intersection of these things, which is might be somebody else reading this would have a completely different reading. So it's been an interesting new genre to delve into. But of course, this is just me and my sort of interpretation. I'm wondering if there is a community or that where there's like a shared sense of criteria for success, and then also if there's like a global forum for this. How does this work, or on a larger scale?
Thank you, and certainly the seal is both probably my favorite if I have to pick one. And the first example I give when someone asks me, tell me the first example that comes to mind of what a photo poetry book is. If we go to the next slide, the question about evaluating such work, I find a particularly interesting and challenging one. Writers and critics and artists have spent a lot of time exploring the relationship between text and image in general. In some cases, principles or even manifestos have appeared in photopoetic books, and we've chosen a few selections here on the screen, all from books that combine photography and poetry, including the first, which was the first known use of the term photo poem. The key messages in these, and which I'd echo, are foremost that the text should not be a caption, nor the image and illustration, but that there should be a more interesting dialogue, and that the text and image should also be strong in their own right. As you said, this sort of moves on into considerations of the different approaches to time. Reading an image and reading a poem are very different, which is also a challenge when you exhibit such work. It's successful when it really challenges the reader and makes them not only want to read it, but to go back and reread. With respect to the global footprint question, we're focusing here on an English language material, but there is a very strong tradition in Latin America. Poets like Neruda, Paz, Cortázar, Vicuña et al. Have all done multiple books in France, Central Europe, Japan, and elsewhere. And so this is very much a global practice, and there are interesting thematic and temporal sort of observations and juxtapositions in that sense. Language is, of course, a challenge in looking at global work, although, as Philip Lorca, of course, has said, photography is a foreign language everyone thinks he speaks. So perhaps it's just as hard to read the images as it is to read the text. We've been talking about poetry and photography, but there is a wider tradition of poetry and images. And I was wondering if you had sort of any comments about that wider picture.
Yeah, I love that quote by Philip Lorca de Corsia. It's just it encapsulates so much, and I think it the way of thinking about photography as a foreign language, you also have to think about how image and text are working in different traditions. And I'm thinking, as you're talking about this, I'm thinking also about Asian traditions, like where ink painting and calligraphy and poetry are actually much more tied together. They're all considered arts of the brush, and were very much considered as this holistic practice. And so in some ways, within ink painting, it could be considered something like writing, and then poetry could be considered something like creating images. And so thinking about how then the camera confronts that and like plays with that in photo poetry is something I'm really interested in. And I'm thinking about in my own work for my dissertation about Chinese art and Chinese photo poetry. So I think that's, I would love to talk to more people about that. I wonder though, I mean, that's one avenue for possibilities, is to explore with different languages and different ways of image, traditions of image and text working together. I wonder though about how technology has also played a role in this. And I wonder if you could say anything about how the genre is evolving with more technology, what the future might hold for it.
Well, as folks may have noticed in the Lady of the Lake example, the early plan for replacing engravings didn't work out so well. The technology at the time really wasn't up to producing hundreds or thousands of copies of a print. And so the introduction of halftone printing and other technologies around 1880 opened up a much wider range of work, and the gradual introduction of other printing technologies in the 20th century allowed for an even wider range of experimentation. So technology is certainly part of the story. The recent availability of very inexpensive digital printing technologies and self-publishing options has opened this up even more, as has the expansion into online platforms and social media. And so the number of artists that are producing work is probably more than ever, from new students to established artists. If we go to the next slide, Instagram and other social media are also enabling much wider exploration of this genre, and many more ways to get your work out into the world. The National Poetry Library in London did a publication last year, an exhibition, I think about 2 years ago, on Instagram poetry. And in terms of popular appeal, Lana Del Rey's Violet Bent Backwards Over the Grass made the New York Times bestseller list last year, to the best of my knowledge, the only photo poetry book to do so. And many artists are embracing some of these online options, either as individuals or as collaborative works, including the example we see here on the screen from Sal Taylor-Kydd, our guest tonight, which we'll be hearing more about shortly. So in brief summary, it's a very vibrant field. It covers a wide range. And hopefully this program will create a few more converts. And I think with that, we turn it back to Catherine.
Well, thank you so much for that overview. So let's look at some examples. I'm going to stop sharing and get our photo lab going. So Dan Lipkin is going to share his camera in the photo lab. Come up in a second. We're going to start. Oh, hi, Dan.
Hello.
There we go. Okay, great. Thank you. So we're going to start with Poetic Localities of Cambridge. This was edited by William James Stillman and published by the J.R. Osgood Company in Boston in 1876. Stillman was a painter and a photographer working in upstate New York, Cambridge, Massachusetts, and England. Poetic Localities is his love letter so that he may, quote, pay tribute to reverent admiration where the muse has given her highest favors, end quote. Dave, do you want to get us started on how this book best represents its genre?
Sure, and thanks, Catherine. This is one of the earlier examples from New England, and one that was very much local. Many of the others from this period were done jointly with publishers in the UK as kind of co-editions. Also, in addition to being an artist, Stillman was also a journalist and diplomat serving in, I think, Rome and Crete. And in the preface to this book, he states, "The ravages of modern improvement bid fair to destroy within not many years the few things amongst us which our poets have made classical." And so this book is also a reaction to the changes sweeping Cambridge, which may sound familiar to many of the people on this call. The texts by Longfellow, Holmes, and Lowell were chosen to generally provide a fairly literal connection between the image and the ostensible subject, although the underlying resistance to modernization and change comes through if you take the time to go back and forth between image and text. Trees also feature particularly prominently in both the images and texts, and are actually a not uncommon motif in lots of photo poetry, as further symbols of durability. Stillman associated, and Stillman here is the photographer, associated with Frederick Church in the US, with Ruskin and the pre-Raphaelites in England, and his work did take on a very wide range of topics. This book goes beyond that of simply presenting literary scenes and references in Cambridge, and so I think is one of the more interesting examples from the period. Also thinking back to the technology discussion, these are some of the earlier examples of mechanical reproductions. The subtitle of this refers to them as heliotypes, which was a process similar to lithography, in which a gelatin plate is exposed and then used to print the images. So it's a rather interesting example from the mid 1870s. And I don't know if anyone else had any comments or reactions to this book.
I think it's just, it's a really beautiful example of how the photograph and the poem are starting to evolve and speak their own language. And I'm particularly drawn to this, this image of the tree and the circle. I always find that the circle and the square create this wonderful tension when used with photography. But I think it's a really beautiful early example of how there's a new narrative that starts to be created as the works start to have a conversation together.
Yeah, I think with that, with that spread, I think, yes, that one. Thanks, Dan. I think this is interesting because it is something about how this particular poem is about the Washington elm on Cambridge. And then you see a photograph of the tree, which you are assuming is also the Washington elm. And it's about this tree in which Washington was rallying the troops in the American Revolution. And so there's this element of Oliver Wendell Holmes writing in 1860, and you're looking at this photograph, but then you're thinking about the American Revolution. So you're using, it's more like the sort of Lady of the Lake, I guess, example, where it's the photograph is providing a setting for you to telescope into the past when you're reading the poem, which I think is, it really works beautifully.
Great, I think we'll move on to our 20th century example, which is Time in New England. The photographs are by Paul Strand. The text is selected and edited by Nancy Newhall, and it was published by the Oxford University Press in New York in 1950. So this work is an example of a collaboration piece. It's divided into 4 chronological periods and then subdivided into further themes. The text, which Dave kind of mentioned earlier, is trying to figure out, does this qualify as a poem? The text in this book includes poetry, poetry, essays, articles, and book excerpts. So Steph, do you want to tell us a little more?
Sure. Thanks, Katie. So Time in New England is a project that is, in Nancy Newhall's words, an autobiography of New England. Newhall was curating photography at MoMA at the tail end of World War II when she gave Paul Strand a retrospective exhibition. And the project really came out of that exhibition. They wanted to try and capture the spirit of a specific place. And they chose New England because they felt it was the cradle of American democracy, and because Newhall was also a Swampscott native. So she is a local person. Newhall and Strand wanted to emphasize the region's deep ties to Puritanism and the historic battles over religious minorities, the witchcraft trials, and abolition, because they felt that issues of tolerance and intolerance were at the heart of America, and they needed to be revisited in the post-war era, which is very, very, I think, relevant for us today too. So there's actually, it's a political position that this book is trying to convey, which I think it's very subtle, but I think one reading the text and images, one gets that sort of feel. The text, as Katie said, is not just poetry. There's also letters and journals, and also even testimonies from the Salem witch trials, which are included here. So they're considered eyewitness accounts, and she's depending on them to actually give you an idea of what the New Englanders themselves would say about their history. And then the photographs, Strand's photographs are interspersed throughout. They're not considered pairings necessarily, but they are supposed to convey the New England spirit in itself. And they wanted to, quote, create a portrait that's more dynamic than either medium could present alone, which I think is interesting. I think there is a way in which Strand, oh, I think that's like a figurehead from the Peabody Essex Museum, actually. I think that the interplay between the text and the images works almost cinematographically, and that there is a rhythm to it. But in some senses, I wonder about it, because the texts are so strong, and then the images are so strong. How do they compete? How you sort of remember one while moving to the next thing or next subject. So it's a really interesting project, and I'd love to spend a little more time thinking about it. Anybody else have observations or comments about it?
Yeah, no, I think you raised a really interesting point in terms of the relationship between the two, because I almost feel as though they're sort of parallel narratives. You know, the photographs present such a strong sense of place, like a real portrait of place, in that sort of, you know, they feel very stark, and but the text is just really quite descriptive and, you know, exhaustive in some cases. So it's, you know, you really, as a reader, you're sort of, you know, going backwards and forwards between the two. You're not really a sort of, you know, as I experienced it, I didn't really appreciate it as a whole in this instance, but more as this sort of, you know, juxtaposition of two narratives.
I also find you know, it's interesting in a couple ways historically. It's you know, begins, or maybe not begins, but is again an early example of starting to use photography and poetry for more sort of activist, protest, social kinds of commentary, which becomes very prevalent globally in the 60s and 70s. There's also a notation that Beaumont Newhall, Nancy's husband, was invited to perform this book by the Rochester Historical Society in 1950, the year it was published. I don't know if he did it, but if so, this would essentially be reading the texts while Strand's images were projected on the wall. It would be one of the first performances of photo poetry. And I would love to know if that actually happened.
We should do something like that at PEM. We should maybe have a performance. That would be really cool.
That would
be very cool.
Yeah.
Well, when you think about it, you know, I mean, poetry is you know, it's the spoken word. You know, we often experience it these days as something that we read, but you know, there's a long oral tradition, of course, that, you know, that is important to embrace, I think, still.
For sure. And I definitely think there's a sound element that I think would be very, very interesting to think about in relation to these photographs. Wow, that's a great photograph.
All right, so let's move to our last book for this section, which will be Chinese Makars. The Scots version of this work is by Robert Crawford. The photographs are by Norman McBeath and John Thompson, and it's published by Easel Press in Edinburgh in 2016. This work combines Scots versions of work by poets or Makars from the classic era of Chinese poetry. At the end of this volume, McBeath and Crawford offer a manifesto, quote, which identifies aspects of their shared practice, but also offers advice for other photo poetry collaborators. Sal, would love to hear your response to this work.
Yeah, this is one of my favorite examples of photography and poetry working together, because it really works on so many different levels. On the one hand, you have this cultural collaboration between the Chinese poems and the Scottish vernacular or the Scottish dialect that they're translated into. And then you have the English version of the poem as well. So as a reader, you know, the sort of the history, Macars is a Scottish term. And a lot of the poems are, you know, go back to the Tang dynasty, which I think was 618, which sort of rose up after the fall of the Roman Empire. So, you know, as a reader, you're not only sort of interpreting this relationship between photograph and image, but you're also sort of exploring, perhaps we can pause there for a moment. You're also exploring this relationship between these different cultural experiences. And, you know, for those of us who aren't familiar with the Scottish, you know, we can read the English, but then you've got how the English relates to the photograph and then the Scottish. So there's this real stew going on. And also another interesting thing here is they're not only contemporary photographs, but if you continue through the book, you know, there's some old photographs in here as well. And it's interesting to think about the thought process that might have gone in, you know, behind those pairings, because I think it's one of the more successful examples of creating a relationship between text and image that brings the illusion, and I mean allusion with an A, so that there are these threads that connect us, but the reader actually has to kind of work a little bit to sort of figure out what that relationship is. So I really enjoy this book. You know, John Thompson's older photographs, I think, are, you know, incredibly evocative of that time. And, you know, the photographs of Norman McBreath too, that you see earlier in the book, if we could go back towards those, I think are just wonderfully subtle. This is one of my favorite pairings, actually, in the creation of that relationship. And, you know, I teach this, you know, I often refer to the manifesto that's in the back of the book when I'm working with students about that relationship between text and image, and, you know, what makes a successful marriage of the two. And I think it's really helpful. And he talks about, you know, how you know, the two should really elevate the work in terms of how they work together, but, you know, they really should be able to stand on their own as well. But sort of trying to move away from that idea of illustrating the text, but sort of providing a deeper, richer experience for the reader.
Yeah, I mean, Crawford and McBeath of the range of their work in this space is quite impressive. And Robert Crawford's also teaches at St. Andrews, and one of his students did his dissertation on photopoetry, which was the first and perhaps still just about the only book published on this is Photopoetry, a Critical History. I also sort of particularly liked the comment, I think it's in the preface, that they make that both Scots and Chinese share a common issue in somehow having to come to terms with the English language, which I think is a sort of, again, fine commentary on the work.
Yeah, I think it's I love this as well. I mean, it's interesting to me because it is making me look at John Thompson's photographs in a completely new light. I've been working a lot on his work for an upcoming exhibition about early photography of China, slated for September 2022. But so these images I think are very, very familiar to me, but then actually seeing them when they're paired with the poems, I'm reading them in a completely new light. There are things that I'm noticing that I don't think I would have noticed before. And so I think the pairing has just, it just, you know, the idea that they could make these things happen and have these connections just blows my mind.
I think this would be a wonderful one to hear read, you know, to hear this, you know, the Scottish being read aloud and paired with the photographs would just be, you know, fantastic. I think really, really moving, really successful.
Yeah, I think so.
Very much. I think we're going to switch gears a little bit and let Sal talk to us a little bit about her work, which we're all looking forward to. So,
Thank you, Katie.
You want to share your screen?
Yes.
Looks great. Thanks.
Thank you. Well, I just wanted to take the opportunity to thank the Peabody Essex Museum and everybody here for giving me this opportunity to share the work. You know, the art of photography and poetry and how they work together is very dear to my heart. I didn't begin as a poet or a photographer, and yet here I find myself, you know, with them being an integral part of my practice. So I thought I'd begin by talking about one of my first projects called Origins, which was one of the first times that I explored that connection between photography and poetry. This work was made during a few summers. We spent every year in Deer Isle in Maine with my family, and my children were young, and I was really watching them sort of exploring the natural world in a way that they didn't have the opportunity to do back home. We were living in Los Angeles at the time. And so, you know, the pond and the water and the natural elements were just providing this wonderful metaphor for me to explore with my work. And I was really interested in this sort of idea of exploration and discovery. And, you know, and for me, my practice really became about the taking of the photographs is a very intuitive, responsive process where I'm really just responding to the world and the stimulus that comes to me through the natural world and through the relationship that my family has with the natural world. And then the writing is really an opportunity to sort of be digesting that experience and trying to understand what the work is about. So I spent this, you know, a few summers sort of making this work and writing at the same time, and they would sort of happen in parallel, but it's never a sort of process of, okay, here's a photograph and now I'm going to write a poem. It's more, I'm writing, and then shooting, and then coming back and writing some more. So it's this very circular process. So the book that came out of this, this work was called Just When I Thought I Had You. And that title comes from a poem. I'd love to read some poems to you as part of this presentation. And this first one is called Sleek as an Otter. Sleek as an otter, your fishy flesh flashes quicksilver in the hot light of noontime. In the murky dark, your skin stands stark against the water before disappearing once again. You are in your element, undeniable. There is no you, no it, no other. Just light, movement, splash, and sinew. You slipped through my fingers. Just when I thought I had you, you were gone. And that kind of sort of speaks to me about the nature of photography itself, really, and what interests me about photography in my practice. And that is really about trying to hold on to time, you know, and like just when I thought I had you, you were gone. You know, you see your children growing every day beside you, and you're trying to hold on frantically to those moments, those precious moments. And photography is a vehicle to do that for me. This is another poem from the same book. She glows golden. She glows golden, this honeyed girl of puckish charm, is everything of woman yet small made. Like a whirl of nested twigs, she is a delicacy of intention. Defined with purpose, yet still forming, she is still not quite ready. This book was an artist book that I put together called Keepsakes. It's a lovely example to talk about because it really was an example of form and function really coming together. So I used a variety of media in this book. The book itself is printed in letterpress. There are photo transfers, photo botanical transfers, and then a platinum palladium print. It features one poem called Keepsakes that is broken into a series of stanzas that then are spread throughout the book. And my reasoning for doing this was that I wanted each sort of folio, they're loose leaf folios, it's not a bound book, to sort of stand on its own as an individual keepsake. So it really is this sort of wonderful marriage of form and function. And again, I sort of found myself returning to those familiar motifs of transformation and time. I was drawn to fossils and butterflies and, you know, chrysalises and, you know, the polywogs in the pond, all these sort of symbols of time passing. This book called The Call is these first few pages are the dummy that I put together for this book. So, you know, sometimes you do one version of the book that is an opportunity to sort of explore the structure of the book, you know, what fonts you want to use, you know, because for me, how the poem is presented physically on the page is part of the expression, in the same way as reading the poem, you know, the verbal experience of the poem is all part of the expression. So doing a dummy sort of gives you the opportunity to explore those ideas and materials. This book is about a telephone call, and it features one poem and one photograph. So in each of my works, you know, the first book sort of has, you know, a poem and a photograph, and then a couple of poems and another, a couple of photographs and then another poem. And then Keepsakes has one poem that goes throughout and several photographs. And this one is just one photograph and one poem. So I kind of like to sort of explore different ways that you can bring text and image together. And this one was sort of, you know, I really wanted to experiment with typography and thinking about how I could use that to express the sort of staccato nature of the phone call, where you're looking for connection and, you know, and not finding it really, and that need to be known. And it was one of the first books as well that I started playing with transparencies, you know, as a sort of metaphor for, you know, memory and, you know, the elusive nature of memory and time passing. So I do find that the book is an ideal vehicle, a great vessel for my work. It appeals to me because it creates this one-on-one relationship between the work and the reader. And my work is sort of quiet and intimate. And so I, you know, it creates a sort of moment for you to experience the work that I think is, for me, it works really well. But it's not always the case. And, you know, so this is an example of an exhibition where we actually wrote the words on the wall. This was in collaboration with 3 other artists in an exhibition in Savannah, Georgia. And this poem here is all about creativity and the struggle of creativity. And it's called Picking Up the Pieces. I saw today that you had made something beautiful, and I knew what it had cost you, that beauty. Too much almost for one person to contain. It was only yesterday that we wrote of the dreary hour of waiting for the spark to break the heavy spell. I'm trying to see the road to there from here, I said. Let's leave now, you replied. We're better there. Something else that has been really interesting recently is working with Instagram. During the pandemic, you know, I was lucky enough to start a project with a good friend of mine, fellow artist Dawn Surratt, where we were exchanging photographs and writing poems that were sort of stimulated by the diptychs that we'd created. And sometimes you'd find, you know, like often I would find Dawn would send me an image, and I would just sort of carry that image in my head as I was sort of driving around town. And then it would start to sort of crystallize around a word and certain phrases. And then you sort of start putting it all together. And it's been a real joy, this creative process. So this poem's called What We Know. Knowledge is a stubborn thing. It holds fast in the shadows, and even as perspective shifts, still shimmers in the witchy light of falsehood. Stories buried deep are told in the lore of a family's choosing, a narrative thread from mother to daughter, then daughter to child, writ large upon a lifetime. In stony ground we grow slant, even the most tender emerging with such vigor, devoid of sunlight will wilt, turn sallow. Illumination then, I'll hold those roots but seek the sun, unfaltering in my telling. I'll lay my secrets in the grass, like a bird drying its wings after the rain. So that brings me to my latest project, Touchstones, that we're going to look through in a moment. Touchstones came about through an exploration of the islands off the coast of Maine in Penobscot Bay during one winter, where my friend Anneli Scar and I, another great collaboration, really wanted to see what these islands felt like in the off-season. So the culmination of the project was a show at the Center for Maine Contemporary Art here that featured my photographs, and then Anneli did this wonderful screen here. And we were really interested in ideas of what sort of sustains these islands in the off-season. You know, after the sort of culmination of the project, I always love to sort of share this image with people, because it shows, you know, you have this sort of body of work, you know, you have this group of photographs, and then you have these poems. And for me, that process of sort of bringing it all together is a very physical one, as I sort of lay everything out and move things around. And with Landfall, the poems really started to emerge as almost chapter markers that sort of delineated these bodies of work, or chapters and collections and groupings of photographs within them, capturing different experiences that we felt when traveling through these islands. So without further ado, I'd love to stop sharing now and go back to the Phillips Library, and we can perhaps look through some of the spreads from Landfall. So this is I did 2 editions of Landfall. One was a limited edition of 100 books, and then this was a collector's edition. And so it features a platinum palladium print and a letterpress piece of the poem, the title poem Landfall, which I'd love to read for you now. In May, they are the first to come. In trees and on rooftops, the tired birds sway, precarious and exhausted. First landfall found, they are delirious and stumble through the streets like old men drunk after closing time. Fresh sheets whip on the line, dancing and flapping like wings struggling for flight. The forsythia spills over garden fences, vibrant and generous, waving its sunny greeting. Spring has come, spring has come. Returning on the ferry that chugs groggily across the bay, I rest my head upon my hand and gaze through windows steamed with salty promise. And so within the case, there's the actual edition of the book that we can look through now. And this was a wonderful collaboration with DATS Press out of Korea. You know, I enjoy making books. I enjoy making artist books, but I also love the, you know, a book I feel is like a film, in that it's ultimately a collaboration. You know, it's the vision of the artist, but also working with book designers and editors and a whole team of people to bring the vision together, which is just so gratifying that you have that opportunity to sort of benefit from everybody else's expertise. And again, you'll see, you know, when we get to one of the poems, the use of vellum. And this, I was very interested in exploring that as a metaphor for the sort of the fog that lies low across the islands in this region. This poem is called Crossing. We hug our arms against our chests and flap like chilly birds to warm and brace ourselves against the stinging wind that snaps unkindly at our faces. The ferry groans and shifts. Like an old lady, she makes her way across the bay, begrudging and proud altogether. Huddled on benches, we squint at the cold, like hardy parishioners, embattled and hopeful, we soldier on, still tethered by this crossing of the sea. Across the bay, the island sleeps, waiting out the hard embrace of winter. So it's just a very, you know, as we explored these islands in the off season, you know, these are places that are incredibly vibrant with, you know, hundreds more people that arrive in the summertime. But during the winter time, there's this incredible stillness and quiet. And it takes, it takes a certain character to live in these places year round. And you feel that, you feel it when you're walking around the cemetery, or, you're sort of meeting the folks in the local stores, or whatever it is. Like, you feel that sort of intense community, and also a real sort of condensed feeling of history. Many of these islands have gone through incredible booms and busts with, granite one year, a series of years where the Italian laborers came, and, so there's this sense, this palpable sense of what has come before, that I always find really interesting to explore in my work. And with that, I would love to sort of turn it over to everybody for some questions. Please let me know anything you'd like to ask me, or, of course, the panel, on anything we've been talking about. But thank you. That is Landfall.
Thank you so much, Sal. I think we'll let Dan maybe continue to flip through while we talk about some things. Yeah, okay. So we do have some questions in the chat. I'll start with this one. Is there a tradition in Western fine art of juxtaposing art and poetry in the same manner that we're looking at the juxtaposition of photography and poetry? And by fine art, we're talking about, painting, drawing, printmaking. Is there a practice of combining that kind of art with poetry as well?
I mean, I think the short answer, of course, is yes. There are many forms of this. There are elements of what's sometimes called pattern poetry, where the poetry is presented on the page, or sometimes ceramic art wall, that takes on form, that takes on a shape that is meant to reflect the content, and that goes back in some cases a couple thousand years. Stephanie, I think, talked about the strong tradition of painting and poetry in East Asian art, especially China, Japan, and Korea. In the West, there was a strong, and is, tradition of many of the graphic arts of combining poetry with drawings, prints, etc. There is a tradition of the sort of livre d'artiste that I think particularly picked up in the late 19th and early 20th century, of creating deluxe editions in France and elsewhere, combining the two. So it's very much a stronger tradition in global art. And as I may have mentioned, in some ways, the early stages of doing photography and poetry were an attempt to emulate what had been already happening with other forms of graphic art. I don't know, Stephanie, if you want to add to.
Well, I was just thinking about that in terms of how much this is about. It's almost a continuation in some senses, because I can think of like illustrated manuscripts are an example of something that's like a very, very, it is a very fine art, but it is also integrating text and image wholly together. But then there is something about, I think, with technology, that it's becoming much, much more accessible, democratic, I guess. Illustrated manuscripts were really made for one person to really enjoy. But then I think in the 19th century, as you have more printing technologies coming about, especially with engravings and then also text and letterpress, that it just makes it much more accessible. And then I think in some ways you could put the photo poetry as a continuation of that. So, and now to Instagram. So I think it is about thinking about the technologies that are making all of this possible.
Yeah, I think Instagram, is just a wonderful tool to collaborate with people. I mean, I know that, for my touchstones project with Dawn, not only is it sort of provided a lifeline through a very difficult time, but it was a way of sort of maintaining an art practice in collaboration with someone else. It's so inspiring to sort of be in that relationship with someone else, where you're sort of writing and making work together. And it just sort of keeps you, you know, it just sort of keeps the muscles going and keeps the ideas coming. And, you know, it's expands the process in the same way that the actual end product sort of expands the experience for the reader or the viewer.
So I have a question for Sal, and maybe we could actually have my own question for Sal too. So do you always work in black and white? And can you tell us what you're working on now?
So I mostly work in black and white, but I have to say that I think of March of last year, when we were sort of staring into the abyss of the pandemic. You know, March in Maine is a difficult time at the best of times. You know, there's a lot of, I'm sure it's the same in Salem, but there's a lot of brown, a lot of gray, and I was just desperate for color. So I actually did do a series during that time that was a color series. So yeah, no, I'm not a purist when it comes to black and white or color in any respect. I'm currently working on a new book called Yesterday, and this is work that I made during summer last year. And it sort of is about, I was working with one other person as a model, and it sort of explores, you know, she's 17 and was just sort of trying to sort of be ready to get out into the world and think about college and all these things, and couldn't, you know. And we were sort of spending time together on this island in Maine that hadn't been hit at that point by the pandemic. And so it was this real sense of this sort of liminal experience where you felt that there was all this chaos happening outside, but we felt sort of protected by it, you know, from it. And so I did a series during that time that is going to come out in October in book form, again with Dutz Press. It's called Yesterday.
Excellent. We'll look forward to that.
Thank you.
I do have a couple more questions, and some of them we might have answered, but does anyone have any other suggestions for contemporary artist book or contemporary photo books that work with historical photos and contemporary poetry? Obviously, Chinese Makars was one of those examples, but do we have any other thoughts on that?
Trying to think. So contemporary poetry with older photographs.
Yes, I believe, or the other way around. I would be interested in that too. But yeah, other thoughts on kind of mixing time periods of medium, maybe.
I don't know, David. Is anything coming to mind for you?
I mean, it's the usual problem of yes, I know there are examples, and I'm trying to sort of conjure up. There's certainly a lot more of the inverse, which would be contemporary photographers who are choosing texts that are often sort of classical forms of poetry.
Yeah.
And so you know, that's probably more frequent than choosing to pair with classic photographs. But I apologize for coming up momentarily empty. I'm sure 30 will, you know, occur to me as soon as we finish the call. So
I know.
Drop me a note. I'll be happy to share the list.
I mean, I think that you know, there's many reasons for that. You know, there's a greater supply of older poetry than photography. You know, it's a much older medium. You know, and we all have our favorite poets that we're moved by, and you know, I've always sort of had a dream of making photographs to Mary Oliver's poems.
Lovely. So we're just about at time, so thank you all so much for joining us this evening. I'd like to thank our speakers, Dave Solo, Stephanie Tung, and Sal Taylor-Kydd, for their diligent work and time devoted to this program. I'd also like to thank Dan Lipkin in our photo lab, and PEM staffers Bethany Beatrice, Corey Dodge, and Mark Wood for helping behind the scenes. Special thanks to everyone who helped us spread the word, especially our friends at Mass Poetry. Dan will be putting a link in the chat for a feedback survey. Please take a minute to tell us what you thought about this program and what you might like to see from us in the future. We hope to see you at another library program soon. Let me just make sure that that gets it. Yeah, great. So the link there is in the chat for feedback. Would really appreciate what you thought about this and what you might think about for the future programs. We hope to see you at another library program again soon. Have a great night. Thank you all so much.